The restaurant glowed like a palace against the dark city night. Golden chandeliers dangled overhead, scattering light across polished marble floors. Waiters in crisp black suits glided between tables, balancing trays of wine and lobster tails, their movements rehearsed and precise. The air smelled of butter, garlic, and money. Expensive laughter echoed through the room, sharp, confident, careless. From the outside, through tall glass windows, the scene looked like something out of a dream. Couples clinked glasses of champagne. Businessmen bragged loudly about deals, and the room buzzed with the comfortable arrogance of people who had never wondered where their next meal would come from. But just beyond those glittering doors, the night told a very different story. The city was cold, the wind sharp, carrying the smell of rain and gasoline. The streets shimmered with puddles that reflected neon signs and passing headlights. And there, standing quietly in the shadows of the restaurant's glowing entrance, was a man. His coat was old and frayed, his shoes worn at the edges, his back slightly bent from years of labor. He held a weathered cap in his hands, turning it nervously as if it were a fragile treasure. His name was George. To the world rushing past him, he was just another tired old man. To most who glanced his way, he was invisible. But if you looked closer, you'd see the creases on his face that told a story of storms weathered and battles fought. You'd see the steady strength in his posture, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity, even though the world had long since stopped offering him respect. George was a veteran, and tonight, after days of going without, he wanted just one warm meal. Not luxury, not champagne, not the laughter of the rich, just a plate of food that would make him feel human again. He hesitated outside those doors, the golden light spilling over him like temptation. He pulled out his wallet and counted the coins inside, nickels, dimes, a couple of crumpled bills. He knew it wasn't enough for anything fancy, but maybe, just maybe, it would be enough for something small. Something warm, something that reminded him of better days. Taking a deep breath, George pushed the door open. The restaurant's chatter softened for a moment as the cold air followed him in. Heads turned. A man in a tailored suit raised an eyebrow. A woman in diamonds whispered to her friend. The waiters exchanged quick glances, their polished rhythm faltering as this out-of-place figure shuffled inside. George's eyes scanned the room, not with envy, but with awe. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. But hunger and hope were stronger than pride tonight. At the far end of the restaurant, in a quiet booth tucked into the corner, another man sat alone. His hood was pulled low over his face, a simple hoodie and jeans disguising the enormity of his frame. He ate in silence, unnoticed by most, but his eyes caught everything. He watched as George entered, watched the stares, the smirks, the way the air shifted like a tide against him. No one knew it yet, but this man, the one who sat quietly in the shadows, would change everything before the night was over. Because what was about to happen inside this golden palace wasn't just dinner, it was a lesson. The narrator's voice deepens, tension thick in the air. When a weary veteran walks into a room filled with wealth and arrogance, respect is nowhere to be found. When a waiter laughs at his struggle, the world joins in mocking him. But on this night, one man will rise. A man whose presence alone can silence the room. A man who knows what it means to fight, to lose, to rise again. And his words will change everything. The camera lingers on George, clutching his old hat, stepping toward the maitre d'. Then it cuts back to the hooded man in the corner, who hasn't moved yet, but whose eyes gleam with quiet strength. And so, the story begins. The heavy restaurant doors closed behind George with a muffled thud, cutting him off from the chill of the night. For a moment he simply stood there, holding his hat against his chest, his eyes adjusting to the golden glow of chandeliers and candles. The warmth of the room brushed against his skin like a memory, soft, unfamiliar, almost too kind. But the warmth did not come from the people. A ripple of silence spread from table to table as heads turned. Forks hovered mid-air, champagne glasses paused mid-toast. Diners looked up from their menus and conversations, their expressions shifting in unison. Some faces softened with a fleeting sympathy, but more often brows furrowed, lips curled, and whispers slid across polished tables like smoke. George knew this feeling. He had walked into rooms like this before, though not in years. He knew exactly what they saw. A man whose coat was patched too many times, whose shoes carried years of wear, whose shoulders were bent with the weight of decades. A man who didn't belong, but George did what he had always done. He straightened his back as best he could, held his hat a little tighter, and gave a polite nod to the room, as if he were a guest among friends rather than an intruder among critics. He stepped forward, careful not to leave wet marks from his old shoes on the polished floor. The murmur of conversation resumed quieter now, like a storm pulling back to gather more strength. At the edge of the room, a young waiter leaned against a podium, tapping his pen impatiently against the reservation book. His hair was slicked back, his smile sharp, but his eyes were cold. He spotted George and let his gaze trail slowly downward, first at the threadbare coat, then at the frayed trousers, and finally at the scuffed shoes. By the time his eyes returned to George's face, his lips had curled into a smirk. "Can I help you, sir?" the waiter asked, dragging out the word sir as though it were an insult. George stopped a few feet away, his voice quiet but steady. "Good evening, son. I was just hoping for a warm meal. Nothing fancy, just something hot to eat." The waiter raised an eyebrow, glancing over George's shoulder as if expecting someone else to follow. When no one did, he tilted his head and let out a small laugh. "This is Le Chateau de Lumière," he said, gesturing broadly to the grand room. "We don't exactly serve soup kitchen portions here." From a nearby table, a man in a suit chuckled into his glass of wine. A woman with diamonds at her throat whispered to her companion, eyes flicking toward George as though he were a curiosity, not a customer. George lowered his gaze, nodding slowly, unshaken by the sting. He had heard worse. He had endured worse. With quiet dignity, he lifted his head again. "I don't need much," he said softly. "Just something simple. A plate of stew, perhaps. Or a sandwich. I can pay." He fumbled with his wallet, opening it carefully. Inside, a few worn bills and coins rattled against the leather. He held it out, his hand steady despite the weakness of the offering. The waiter's eyes flicked to the money and back, his smirk widening. "A sandwich," he repeated loudly enough for the nearby diners to hear. "At Le Chateau." A ripple of laughter drifted through the room. Some covered their mouths, pretending it wasn't cruel. Others didn't bother to hide their disdain. George didn't flinch. His eyes remained calm, his posture respectful. He placed his hat over his heart, as though standing at attention. "I'm not asking for charity," he said. "Just a hot meal." And there it was, the quiet dignity of a man who had given his best years to serve, who had stood in places where survival meant more than reputation. George didn't beg. He didn't demand. He simply asked humbly for something he had earned 100 times over in the sacrifices of his past. The waiter's smirk faltered for a second, but pride held his face stiff. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to let disdain drip from every word. "This isn't the place for people like you." The words landed harder than the laughter. George's shoulders dipped slightly, not in defeat, but in the weight of recognition. He had heard those words too many times. At job interviews, at rental offices, in waiting rooms where his service medals meant nothing. And yet, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stood taller, clutching his hat, and whispered, "I served this country. I don't need a table with gold plates. Just kindness." The room fell quiet for a moment. A few diners looked down at their plates, shame flickering in their eyes. Others scoffed, unwilling to let compassion touch them. The waiter shifted uncomfortably, caught between mockery and a hint of guilt. But George simply waited, patient, respectful, standing in the golden glow of chandeliers as if he had all the time in the world. Unseen in the corner booth, the hooded man set down his fork. His eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw tightening. He had been silent until now, but his focus sharpened. The story was just beginning. George lowered himself slowly into the chair the waiter had offered, almost mockingly, his old knees cracking as he sat. He placed his hat carefully on the edge of the table, smoothing it with one hand as though it were made of glass. His wallet rested beside it, worn thin, edges frayed, its leather soft from years of being opened and closed. He pulled it closer, hesitating. He hated this part. With a steadying breath, he unbuttoned the clasp and peered inside. The sight was always the same. A few wrinkled bills, coins rattling in the folds, and an old photograph tucked behind the sleeve, yellowed and creased, but still holding the smiling faces of men in uniform. George's hand lingered on the picture, his brothers in arms, Some of them had never come home. Some had, only to fight different battles in silence. He had promised to carry their memory, and he did every day. Tonight he carried them into this restaurant, into the judgment of strangers. He shook his head gently, pulling the coins into his palm. They clinked softly, too few, too loud in the hush of the dining room. He laid them out in front of him like pieces of himself, quarters, nickels, a single crumpled $5 bill. He smoothed the bill with his fingers, embarrassed by the act of trying to make it look more respectable. This should cover a small plate, he murmured, mostly to himself, his voice soft and apologetic, as though he were asking forgiveness from the table itself. Nothing more. Just something warm. It's been a long day. The waiter hovering nearby leaned over with exaggerated politeness, his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sir," he said, each word sharp, "this isn't a soup kitchen. We don't do small plates." A few diners chuckled, their laughter spreading like ripples in water. George's ears flushed red, but he didn't flinch. He carefully gathered the coins back into his wallet, his movements slow, deliberate. He refused to let his hands shake, refused to let them see weakness. He straightened in his chair, folding his weathered hands on the table. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't need much. Just a simple meal." The waiter tilted his head, feigning sympathy. "And how do you plan to pay for this simple meal, sir? With nickels and dimes? Maybe we can find you a leftover roll from the kitchen." Laughter again, sharper this time. George's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the polished table surface. He could see their reflections in it, the waiter's smirk, the diner's sneers. He didn't respond, because George had learned long ago that silence carried more dignity than anger. But inside, his heart ached. His mind drifted back, unbidden to a night lit not by chandeliers, but by tracer fire. He was young again, crouched in the mud beside men who trusted him with their lives. The stench of smoke, the deafening blasts of artillery, the fear they swallowed together. It all rose in his chest like a tide. He remembered the faces. Carter, who cracked jokes to calm them before every mission. Morales, who carried a photo of his newborn daughter in his breast pocket. He remembered the moment Carter didn't get back up. The silence after the gunfire. The way George had to keep moving, keep leading, even as his heart splintered. He blinked, pulling himself back to the present. The chandelier's light glimmered above, so different from the stars he had stared at from trenches, wondering if he would live to see another sunrise. Now here he was, decades later, sitting in a fine restaurant, mocked for wanting a hot meal, his lips pressed into a thin line. They wouldn't understand, he thought. They couldn't. But the truth carved deep inside him was simple. Those men had died for a world where laughter and wine in places like this could exist. He had carried their sacrifice, and tonight all he wanted was one warm plate of food to remember he was still alive. The waiter leaned in closer, whispering so only George could hear. "Do yourself a favor, old man. Places like this aren't meant for people like you. Why don't you try down the block? Maybe they'll serve you without a fuss." George looked up then, his eyes tired but steady. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. His pride, though battered, remained intact. He simply nodded once, lips curling into a faint, almost invisible smile. "Thank you," he said softly. The waiter blinked, momentarily caught off guard. There was no bitterness in George's voice, no anger. Just a quiet dignity that made the mockery ring hollow. But George's heart was heavy. His hands returned to the wallet, brushing once more against the old photograph inside. He whispered inwardly to the men in the photo, his brothers, "I made it home. But nights like this, sometimes I wonder if I really did." He exhaled, steadying himself again. His hunger gnawed, his pride stung, but he endured. Because that was what George had always done, endure. What he didn't know was that someone else quietly watching from across the room had seen everything. George sat very still, his back stiff, his hat resting carefully on his lap like a shield. The menu in front of him was heavy with dishes he couldn't pronounce, plates worth more than an entire week's pension. His fingers traced the laminated edges, but he didn't linger on the lobster or the champagne pairings. His eyes slid past the glossy photographs of steak and seafood, past the carefully worded descriptions meant to seduce the wealthy, until he found something tucked near the bottom in smaller print. Vegetable soup, $6.50. His heart eased a little. That at least he thought he could afford. Something warm, something simple, He cleared his throat softly and raised his eyes to the waiter, who stood tapping a pen against his pad. Impatience painted on his face. I'll just have the soup," George said quietly, his voice respectful, careful. "Vegetable. That will be fine," the waiter smirked. "Just the soup?" His words were loud enough for the diners at the nearest tables to hear. "Sir, most of our guests don't bother with just soup. But if that's all you can manage..." A ripple of chuckles floated from a corner booth. Someone muttered, "Cheap." Another said, "What's he even doing here?" George's cheeks burned, but he nodded politely. "Yes, just the soup. Thank you." When the bowl arrived, steam rising gently, George's hands trembled as he wrapped them around it. The smell was earthy, savory. To anyone else in the room it was nothing, a starter dish hardly worth attention. But to him it was a feast. He bowed his head briefly, murmuring something only he could hear. A prayer of gratitude not for the food itself, but for the chance to sit like everyone else. If only for one meal. He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful. His eyes softened as the warmth spread through him, his thoughts drifting far away. He imagined himself at home again, at a dinner table that no longer existed, his wife setting down a steaming pot, his daughter laughing about school. The clinking of cutlery around the restaurant faded into memory's echo, and for a few minutes, George wasn't alone, but peace is fragile. When the last spoonful was gone, the bowl scraped clean, the bill was placed before him. George pulled out his wallet, the same one that had been mocked earlier, and carefully unfolded the small bills and coins. He lined them up in neat stacks, his lips moving as he counted under his breath. $6.50? $6.75. He froze. His fingers fumbled over the last coin, searching, desperate. His heart sank. He was short, just 75 cents short. The blood drained from his face. He patted his coat pockets quickly, then the floor near his chair, praying a coin might have slipped out unnoticed. Nothing. Only lint and silence. The waiter hovered nearby, watching with keen interest, his smirk widening with every second. Finally, his voice cracked like a whip through the quiet. "You can't even pay for that." Heads turned instantly. Conversations died. The din of silverware stilled. All eyes locked onto the old veteran hunched over the table, coins scattered like evidence of his failure. George's hands trembled as he gathered the change back into his palm. I thought I had enough," he said softly, his voice nearly lost in the swell of whispers and snickers. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean..." The waiter leaned closer, raising his voice deliberately so the entire room could hear. "Sir, this is a restaurant, not a charity. If you can't pay, maybe you shouldn't be here at all." Laughter rolled through the dining hall, cruel and sharp. Phones were raised, screens glowing as diners began recording the spectacle. Some smirked, others whispered comments laced with venom. Unbelievable. Trying to play rich on pennies. He probably wants someone else to pick up his tab. George swallowed hard, his throat dry as ash. He straightened his back, though his eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. He gathered the coins into his weathered hands, clutching them like the last remnants of his pride. "I'm sorry," he repeated softly. "It was my mistake, but the waiter wasn't done." He sneered, his words dripping with cruelty. "Maybe you should try earning money instead of living off pity. People here work for a living. We don't beg." A hush swept the room, followed by a low collective murmur. The words had landed heavy and the mockery felt almost unbearable. George's grip tightened on his old hat, his knuckles white. He stared down at the faded brim, the hat that had shielded his head from sun and rain on countless long marches, the hat that had once crowned a young soldier full of purpose. His shoulders trembled, not from rage, but from the crushing weight of humiliation. The tears finally welled, shimmering in his eyes. But he blinked them back, refusing to let them fall in front of those who laughed. He would not beg. He would not let them strip him of the last thread of dignity he had left. Silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint buzz of recording phones. George sat there, coins clutched tight in one hand, hat pressed against his chest with the other, his lips pressed together in a thin line, a proud man broken, but unbowed. For a moment, the restaurant was frozen in cruel laughter and hushed whispers. George sat hunched at his table, clutching his old hat like a lifeline, coins scattered before him like proof of his humiliation. The waiter stood tall, chest puffed out with arrogant pride, basking in the attention. Diners leaned in, some recording on their phones, others shaking their heads at the sad spectacle. But in the far corner of the restaurant, where shadows softened the golden glow of chandeliers, sat a man no one had paid attention to. He had been there the entire time. A large figure, quiet, composed, dressed in a plain gray hoodie with the hood pulled low. He didn't sparkle with jewelry. He didn't flash designer clothes. He didn't demand attention. Instead, he sat calmly, eating his modest meal with deliberate, unhurried motions, as though the cruelty unfolding just a few tables away had not yet disturbed his peace. But his eyes told a different story. Beneath the shadow of the hood, sharp, steady eyes watched George carefully, every tremble of the veteran's hand, every word of mockery hurled by the waiter, every cruel chuckle from the crowd. He had seen it all, and though he remained silent, the air around him seemed heavier, charged as if he carried with him the weight of a storm. At first, no one noticed him. Why would they? In a place where wealth screamed for attention, humility blended into the wallpaper. But whispers have a way of spreading, and one sharp-eyed diner finally froze mid-sentence, his gaze locking on the broad shoulders beneath the hoodie. "Wait," he whispered, tugging at his friend's sleeve. "Look over there. Doesn't he look familiar?" The friend followed his gaze. His eyes widened and he leaned in close. No way, it's him. What would he be doing here? Another diner craned his neck, squinting through the dim light of the corner. He inhaled sharply, nearly choking on his champagne. "I swear that's him. Look at the size of him. No one else looks like that." The whispers spread like fire through dry grass. "Is it really? Can't be." "No, it is. That's The Rock." Phones lowered from George. For the first time since the humiliation began, attention shifted. Heads turned toward the corner table. Gasps punctuated the air as recognition rippled across the room. The waiter frowned, irritated that the spotlight was slipping away. He followed their gaze and rolled his eyes dramatically. "Oh, please," he scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "Even if it is him, celebrities don't change anything. They can't help freeloaders like this old man." His words hung in the air like poison, but the diners were no longer laughing. The room buzzed with nervous anticipation, the energy shifting. Something was happening. Something no one had expected when they walked in that evening. The man in the hoodie, calm until now, placed his fork down slowly, the faintest clink ringing against the plate. His massive hands folded once on the table, then he pushed his chair back. The sound was small, just wood scraping against marble tile, but it cut through the restaurant like thunder. Every laugh died instantly, every whisper silenced. He rose to his feet, and when he did, the entire atmosphere changed. The hoodie shifted with the motion, stretching across broad shoulders, the fabric struggling to contain the mass of muscle beneath. He stood taller than anyone else in the room, towering over the tables even from across the hall. His presence alone commanded attention, an immovable mountain among fragile glass and porcelain. The laughter was gone. The mockery was gone. All that remained was silence, heavy, breathless, expectant. George looked up, startled, his weary eyes catching the motion. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face. Who was this stranger rising from the shadows, and why did the entire restaurant seem to hold its breath at his every move? The man didn't rush. He didn't need to. His very slowness, the deliberate nature of each step, only deepened the suspense. His boots struck the floor softly but carried weight, a rhythm that echoed in the chests of every diner present. The waiter swallowed hard but tried to maintain his bravado. "What's this about, huh? You think standing up like that is going to change anything?" This old man still can't pay his bill, but his voice cracked, betraying the fear hiding beneath his arrogance. The man in the hoodie didn't answer, not yet. He kept walking, steady, unhurried, until he reached the center of the room. The crowd parted instinctively as though gravity itself had shifted around him. The golden chandeliers glimmered against the wet sheen of his hoodie, and his shadow stretched long across the polished floor, spilling toward George. The veteran clutched his hat tighter, blinking up at the stranger now standing between him and the crowd. The restaurant was silent. Phones still hovered, but no one dared speak, and then he lifted his hands. In one slow motion, he reached up, grasped the edges of his hood, and began to pull it back. Gasps burst like fireworks around the room. Whispers turned to shouts of recognition. "It's him! Oh my God, it's The Rock. Dwayne Johnson! He's here! The waiter stumbled back, his smirk dissolving into shock. Diners who had laughed at George seconds ago now scrambled for their phones, eager to capture the moment. But no camera could capture the weight of what filled the room, because Dwayne Johnson wasn't just standing there. He was a force. His calm, his size, his silence, it was enough to make the entire hall tremble, and he hadn't even spoken yet. But everyone knew. Whatever he was about to say would change everything. The room held its breath. The towering figure in the hoodie stood at the center of the restaurant, the golden chandelier lights glinting off his damp shoulders. He reached up, slow and deliberate, and pulled back the hood. Gasps tore through the air like a lightning strike. It's him. Oh my God, it's The Rock. Dwayne Johnson? It's really him. The room erupted in whispers, phones flying into the air like a sea of glowing stars. Diners scrambled to record, fingers trembling with excitement, voices overlapping in disbelief. The very same people who had laughed at George seconds ago were now leaning over tables, desperate to catch a glimpse, desperate to document the moment for their feeds. But The Rock didn't look at them. He didn't look at the flashing cameras or the eager eyes. His gaze cut through the crowd and landed squarely on George, the trembling veteran clutching his hat with one hand and his pride with the other. The room was buzzing, but in that moment, for George, it felt utterly silent. The Rock moved forward, his steps calm, his massive frame cutting through the crowd like a ship through water. The waiter, still holding the bill in his hand as though it were a weapon, faltered. His arrogance evaporated, leaving behind only fear and confusion. The Rock stopped in front of him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scowl. He simply extended his hand, palm open. "Give me the bill," he said. The waiter hesitated, his lips parting as if to argue. But one look at the intensity in The Rock's eyes ended that thought before it began. His fingers trembled as he placed the slip of paper into The Rock's hand. The Rock glanced at it for barely a second before folding it between his fingers. Then in a voice that carried through the restaurant, not loud, but firm, steady, undeniable, he spoke. "I'll cover this." The crowd gasped again, this time softer, more reverent. But he wasn't finished. His eyes swept the room, meeting the stares of the wealthy diners, the curious gawkers, the mocking faces now frozen with guilt. "In fact," he paused, letting the silence settle, "I'll cover every veteran who ever walks through these doors." The words detonated like thunder. The restaurant exploded in sound. Applause erupted, echoing against marble walls. Diners who had once sneered were now on their feet, clapping, some even crying. The atmosphere shifted from cruelty to awe in the span of seconds. It was as if the entire building itself sighed with relief. George sat frozen, unable to move, unable to process what he had just heard. His lips quivered, his eyes blurred with tears. "No, I can't let you do that," he whispered, his voice fragile. "It's too much. I can't accept it." The Rock crouched slightly so that his massive frame could meet George's weary eyes. He placed a firm, grounding hand on George's shoulder. His grip was steady but not heavy, like an anchor holding him in place. "George," he said softly, calling him by name though they had never spoken. "You've already given more than enough." The veteran blinked, stunned. The weight of the hand on his shoulder wasn't just physical. It was respect, honor, and dignity restored in an instant. The Rock straightened, turning to the waiter whose smirk had long since dissolved. The young man's face was pale, his hands trembling as he struggled to find words. The Rock's gaze cut into him, not with cruelty, but with undeniable truth. "You thought it was funny to humiliate a man who's given everything for people like you," The Rock said, his tone calm, but sharp as steel. "But let me tell you something. You'll never understand true sacrifice until you've walked in his shoes." The waiter swallowed hard, shrinking under the weight of the words. He looked down at his polished shoes, shame painting his face. Meanwhile, the applause grew louder. Diners rose to their feet, their clapping echoing like waves of thunder. Some wiped away tears, others recorded, but now it wasn't for mockery. It was to capture the moment of redemption, the moment dignity was restored. George tried again to protest, clutching his old hat tightly. "I don't deserve this. I was just trying to..." But The Rock's hand pressed gently but firmly against his shoulder once more, silencing him with warmth instead of force. "You do deserve this," he said, his voice carrying through the crowd. "You fought for this country. You carried burdens no one here can imagine. You walked through fire so that the rest of us could sit here in peace and eat meals without fear. Don't you dare think you're not worthy." George's lips trembled as tears streamed freely down his cheeks. He lowered his head, overwhelmed, his dignity breaking not from shame this time, but from being honored. The applause swelled again. Diners clapped harder, some standing on chairs to see better. Strangers who had sneered now looked at George with admiration. The Rock lifted the bill high in the air for everyone to see, then tore it in half. The pieces drifted down like confetti, landing on the polished floor. "Tonight," he declared, "this man eats with dignity, and every veteran who steps foot in this place will eat with the respect they earned." The crowd roared. Applause thundered. Even the chef emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands, his eyes shining with emotion as he clapped along. And in the middle of it all, George sat trembling, his old hat pressed to his chest, his eyes swimming with tears of gratitude. The Rock placed his hand one last time on his shoulder, leaning close so only he could hear. "You're not invisible, brother. Not tonight. Not ever again." George closed his eyes, whispering the only words he could manage. "Thank you." The Rock stood tall once more, his presence filling the restaurant with something it had been missing all along: honor. And for the first time that night, George smiled. The applause slowly faded, leaving only the soft clink of silverware and the muted hum of the chandelier above. The Rock stood tall in the center of the dining room, his massive frame commanding every eye, every breath, every ounce of attention. George sat trembling at his table, clutching his old hat as though it were a lifeline. The torn bill still lay in shreds on the floor, a symbol of dignity restored. But the weight of humiliation still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The Rock's gaze swept across the room, pausing on the diners who had laughed, lingering on the waiter who now shifted uncomfortably under the spotlight of shame. Finally, his eyes softened as they landed back on George, the tired veteran whose life of sacrifice had been reduced to a cruel joke just minutes earlier. The Rock took a deep breath, and then, in a voice that rolled like thunder but carried warmth like fire, he began. "I grew up with nothing," he said, his words slow and deliberate, as though each one carried the weight of memory. "My mom and I lived paycheck to paycheck. Some nights, we didn't know if we'd even have a roof over our heads. I still remember the day we were evicted. We had $7 left to our name. 7, that's all we had." A murmur swept through the diners. Heads lowered. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It wasn't the kind of story they expected to hear in this gilded dining room filled with champagne and gold trim. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," The Rock continued, his voice deepened, carrying pain that was not rehearsed but lived. "To walk into places where people look at you and see nothing but your clothes, your shoes, your skin. To see you as less than human. I know what it's like when people laugh, when they mock, when they think you don't belong." He gestured to George, his massive hand firm but respectful. "And that's exactly what happened here tonight. You looked at this man," he said, his gaze cutting into the waiter like a blade, "and you saw weakness. You saw poverty. You saw someone you thought you could ridicule because you believed you were above him." The waiter's lips parted, as if to protest, but The Rock's voice surged forward, silencing him before a word could escape. "But you didn't see the truth. You didn't see the years he gave, years of his life spent serving his country. You didn't see the sacrifices he made so that you could stand here, laugh, and serve meals in peace. You didn't see the brothers he lost, the nights he still remembers, the burden he carries so the rest of us could live free." The Rock's chest heaved slightly as emotions surged through him. He took a step closer to the waiter, his shadow falling heavy across the polished floor. "Respect," he said, his voice now sharp as steel, "isn't earned by mocking the weak. Respect is earned by sacrifice. And this man," he pointed firmly to George, "has given more than you will ever understand." The room erupted in silence so thick it was almost deafening. Diners stared at the floor, at their plates, at the man who had just been humiliated and now stood lifted higher than any of them. Some covered their mouths, tears glistening in their eyes. Others nodded, their own shame mirrored in their expressions. George bowed his head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His lips trembled as he whispered, "I don't deserve all this." The Rock crouched slightly again, his massive hand returning to George's frail shoulder. His voice softened, stripped of thunder, filled only with truth. "You deserve more than this," he said gently. "More than this room, more than this applause, more than the world will ever repay. Because the world can't repay what you gave. It never could. George's eyes welled with tears. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. He clutched his hat tighter, pressing it to his chest, his body trembling from the weight of emotions he had buried for years. Grief, pride, sacrifice, and finally, recognition. The Rock turned back to the diners, his voice rising once more. This is the problem with the world today. We celebrate wealth. We celebrate fame. We celebrate power. But we forget the ones who made all of that possible. We forget the men and women who sacrificed their youth, their families, their bodies, their very lives to protect the freedom we take for granted. He gestured to George again, his voice steady but full of fire. This man doesn't need your pity. He doesn't need your laughter. What he deserves is your respect, your gratitude, your recognition. And tonight, that's what he's going to get. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger, rolling through the room like a wave of thunder. Diners stood, some with tears in their eyes, clapping, their faces transformed by the truth of his words. Even those who had sneered earlier now joined in, their shame dissolved in the light of honor. George shook his head, overwhelmed. Please, he whispered, I was just doing my duty. I don't want the spotlight. I don't. The Rock smiled gently, his massive hand squeezing George's shoulder with quiet strength. And that's exactly why you deserve it, he said. Because true heroes never ask for it. True heroes never seek recognition. They serve because it's the right thing to do. And that's what makes them great. The crowd cheered louder now. Some diners wiped their eyes with napkins. Others shouted, "Thank you for your service." The atmosphere had shifted entirely. No longer a room of arrogance, but of reverence. The Rock straightened, his gaze sweeping once more across the crowd, making sure every eye met his. Let tonight be a reminder, he said firmly. That respect isn't measured by your wallet, your suit, or your title. Respect is measured by sacrifice. And when you see someone who gave everything so you could live free, you don't laugh. You stand. The diners obeyed. Chairs scraped back as one by one, every person in the room rose to their feet. The applause thundered through the restaurant, shaking the very walls. For the first time in years, George felt taller, not because he stood, but because an entire room stood for him. His eyes blurred with tears as he whispered, barely audible over the roar, "Thank you. Thank you." The Rock leaned closer one last time, his voice low, meant only for George. "Brother, you don't have to thank me. You've already given more than I ever could. Tonight it's our turn to thank you." And with that, the Rock turned to the crowd, his chest heaving, his presence filling every corner of the room. The applause grew louder still. Diners clapped until their palms ached, some crying openly, some saluting, some bowing their heads in respect. And George clutched his old hat to his heart, tears streaming down his weathered face, his dignity restored. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Not as a beggar, not as a burden, but as what he truly was, a hero. The applause still thundered in the lavish restaurant, but Dwayne Johnson slowly raised his hand. The clapping faded. Voices died down, and soon the room was so quiet that even the hum of the chandelier's lights could be heard. George sat trembling in his chair, his old hat pressed against his chest, his weathered hands shaking as though holding back a lifetime of memories. His eyes darted around the room, uncertain, overwhelmed by the attention he had never asked for. The Rock crouched down beside him again, his voice low but steady. "George," he said gently, "they need to hear your story. Not because you owe it to them, but because you deserve to be heard. For too long you've carried it all in silence. Tonight it's time to let it out." George swallowed hard. His lips trembled. I'm no good with speeches," he whispered. The Rock's hand tightened on his shoulder. "You don't need a speech. Just tell them who you are." "That's enough." The room held its breath. Diners leaned forward. Waiters froze in place, phones hung in the air, recording but unnoticed. Even the arrogant young waiter who only minutes earlier had sneered at him stood still, his head slightly bowed, shame burning across his face. George took a shaky breath and lifted his head. His voice was raspy, worn by years and hardship, but it carried a rawness that gripped every heart in the room. "I was just a kid when I signed up," George began. "Barely 18. My mama cried at the bus station, begged me not to go, but I told her I had to. My country needed me. And at 18 you think you're invincible. You think nothing bad can happen to you. His eyes grew distant, lost in memory. But it did. I saw things I'll never forget. I watched friends fall beside me. Brothers I swore I'd protect. We were boys one day and soldiers the next. And in one moment they were gone. Just like that. Names etched on stone monuments back home. But faces I still see every night when I close my eyes. A hush swept through the room. Diners who had once laughed now sat frozen, tears glistening in their eyes. George's voice cracked, but he pressed on. When I came home, I wasn't the same. None of us were. They told us we were heroes, but the parades don't last. The medals don't pay the rent. The nightmares don't stop just because you're back on American soil. I tried to live normal. I worked small jobs, janitor, handyman, whatever I could find. Never complained. Just worked. Paid my bills. Tried to keep going. His fingers clenched tighter around the brim of his hat, but it's hard. Years go by, and you watch the world move faster while you slow down. Your body aches. Your friends are gone. And people look at you not as someone who gave his youth for freedom, but as a burden. A shadow, someone who doesn't belong. A murmur of regret rippled through the crowd. The wealthy diners who had scoffed earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their velvet chairs. Some dabbed their eyes with linen napkins. George's voice softened. Tonight, I saved for months. Every penny from my pension. Skipped meals. Cut corners. Just so I could walk into a place like this, sit down, and remember what it feels like to matter. Not to be rich. Not to be special. Just to sit like everybody else, order a meal, and feel human again. A tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away, but instead I got laughed at, mocked, humiliated, like I didn't belong, like all I'd ever done counted for nothing. He looked down, shaking his head, his voice breaking. All I wanted was a hot meal. Just one night where I didn't feel invisible. The silence that followed was crushing. No fork clinked, no whisper rose, only the sound of rain tapping faintly against the windows, and then, the smallest sound, a stifled sob from a woman near the back. Soon after, another diner bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. The Rock stood slowly, his massive presence towering once more, but his eyes remained locked on George, pride radiating from him. You see, The Rock said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. This is what sacrifice looks like. This is what dignity sounds like. And this is what we've all been too blind to see. He turned his gaze toward the young waiter, the same one who had mocked George moments ago. The boy's face was pale, his arrogance stripped away. He lowered his head in shame, unable to meet George's eyes. The Rock's voice cut through the silence. You laughed at him. You mocked him. But tell me, what have you given? What have you sacrificed? What have you endured that gives you the right to stand above this man? The waiter opened his mouth, but no words came. He stared at the floor, his jaw trembling, shame drowning him. George shifted, trying to stand, but The Rock gently pressed him back into his chair. No, brother, he said softly. Tonight you sit. Tonight you're honored. George's lips trembled. I don't deserve all this. I was just doing my duty. I didn't do anything special. The Rock leaned close, his voice low but powerful enough for the entire room to hear. And that's why you do deserve it. Because heroes never think they're heroes. But the rest of us, we know the truth. The crowd erupted in applause again, louder than before, rising like a tide of redemption. Diners stood, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. Tears streamed down cheeks. Some placed hands over their hearts. Others saluted quietly. Even the young waiter, still trembling, whispered, I'm sorry. His voice cracked, but it was the only truth he could muster. George clutched his hat against his chest, his body shaking with sobs he had buried for decades. And yet, beneath the tears, his face shone with something he hadn't felt in years. Dignity. The Rock's hand remained firm on his shoulder, anchoring him through the storm of emotions, and for the first time in a long time, George felt seen. Not as a burden, not as a relic, not as a man past his prime, but as what he truly was, a veteran, a protector, a hero. The restaurant was silent for a long heartbeat after George finished his truth. The air hung heavy, not with mockery anymore, but with shame, with reverence, with something fragile waiting to break open. Then slowly, like sunlight pushing through storm clouds, kindness began to rise. A woman in her 60s, dressed in a navy blue suit, stood from her table near the front. Her voice trembled as she spoke. My husband, he was a veteran too. He passed last year, but he founded a small foundation to support veterans who struggled after coming home. I help run it now. George, she stepped closer, eyes soft with compassion. If you'd allow it, I would be honored to give you a job with us. You've given enough. Now it's time someone gave back. Gasps rippled through the room. George's lips parted, stunned. He gripped his hat tighter, tears glistening in his eyes. A job? He whispered, as if the word itself felt too good to be real. The Rock nodded firmly at her. That's what respect looks like. Then, another diner rose, this time a man in a pressed suit with silver at his temples. He raised his glass, his voice ringing with sincerity. Put me down for his meals, every night, every week for a year. No veteran should ever worry about going hungry in this country. Applause echoed again, stronger, warmer. From the back of the room, a teenager stood, his phone still in his hand but lowered now. Shame painted across his face. I laughed earlier, he admitted, voice cracking. But I was wrong, sir. He turned to George. You deserve better. I don't have much, but here. He pulled a crumpled $20 bill from his wallet and set it gently on the table. It's yours. Thank you for what you did, for all of us. George's shoulders shook. He tried to speak, but no words came, only a choked sob he couldn't hold back anymore. The Rock stepped closer, resting his massive hand on George's trembling shoulder. His voice was steady like bedrock. You hear that, brother? You're not forgotten. You never were. The world may have turned its back for a while, but not tonight. Not ever again. George covered his face with his hands, overcome. His voice broke through the sobs, fragile but clear. I thought the world forgot us. The Rock crouched down, meeting his eyes at level. His smile was soft, almost fatherly. Not tonight, he said gently. Not ever again. The crowd erupted, not with shallow clapping this time, but with heartfelt applause, cheers, and even tears. Strangers crossed the room to shake George's hand. Some hugged him. Others whispered thank yous. The atmosphere had transformed. The same room that once rang with cruel laughter now overflowed with respect, unity, and compassion. The young waiter, pale and shaken, stepped forward, his voice trembling. Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't see you. I didn't respect you. I was wrong. He bowed his head low, too ashamed to look George in the eye. George, through his tears, extended a hand. His voice was weak, but steady. Son, respect starts with admitting when you're wrong. You've taken the first step. The waiter's chest hitched as he shook George's hand, tears slipping down his face. The Rock straightened, his booming voice filling the room once more. Tonight, this man reminded us all what honor looks like. He carried sacrifice on his back, dignity in his heart, and humility in his soul. Respect isn't about wealth, it isn't about status. Respect is about service, sacrifice, love for something greater than yourself. And George, he clapped, his shoulder firmly. You have more respect than this room could ever hold. Applause shook the chandeliers above. Diners stood clapping until their hands turned red, many crying openly. Some saluted quietly, others whispered prayers of thanks. George sat overwhelmed, his old hat still pressed to his chest. But for the first time in years, perhaps decades, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel forgotten. He felt seen. He felt honored. He felt like he mattered again. And as the Rock stood beside him, smiling proudly, the once cold restaurant glowed not with gold chandeliers, but with something far brighter. Unity, compassion, and the kind of respect money could never buy.